How did a handful of insurgents manage to break the chains of an invincible empire? How did a simple local revolt turn into a global earthquake? Welcome to Past Flu, where history changes forever. Today, we dive into one of the most explosive events of all time, an uprising that should never have succeeded, opposed to one of the greatest powers in history, to a formidable army, to an unquestioned dominance. And yet, against all odds, they stood up, struck hard, and overturned the established order. At that moment, an empire wavered. At that moment, a nation was born. But before embarking on a new adventure, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy the journey. At the very beginning of the 17th century, England embarked on the exploration and colonization of the North American continent. The year 1607 marked a decisive turning point. In the region that would become Virginia, the London Company founded Jamestown, named after King James I. This first English settlement, located on land already inhabited by Native American tribes, was motivated by the search for wealth and new commercial opportunities. The settlers hoped to discover gold and precious materials, following the example of the Spanish conquistadors in Central and South America. However, the reality proved harsher than expected. Poor harvests, tropical diseases, and hostility from local populations decimated nearly half the first arrivals. Nevertheless, tobacco cultivation eventually provided a viable economic solution. Throughout the 1610s and 1620s, this precious commodity attracted new settlers and allowed Jamestown to become permanently established, paving the way for the birth of the Virginia colony. In 1620, another major episode occurred with the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers aboard the Mayflower. These religious dissenters from the Puritan movement were fleeing persecution in England. Their settlement on the shores of Massachusetts Bay in the northeast of the continent symbolizes another facet of English colonization, the quest for religious freedom. Quickly, other Puritans joined them, particularly within the Massachusetts Bay Company. The lands of New England thus became a refuge for these believers who hoped to establish a city upon a hill, a pious and exemplary society. In contrast to Virginia's more strictly commercial orientation, the Massachusetts colony organized around strong religious principles and a tight-knit community life. Throughout the 17th century, other colonies emerged along the Atlantic coast. Pennsylvania, granted in 1681 to William Penn, a Quaker wishing to establish a haven of religious tolerance. Maryland, initially conceived as a refuge for Catholics. Or Georgia, founded in 1733 as a penal colony and strategic buffer against Spanish Florida. Thus, if we count Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Georgia, we get the famous 13 colonies. Each has its particular identity based on economic, religious, or strategic motivations. Despite this diversity, ties with the British Crown are structured in a somewhat similar manner. The colonies are governed by royal charters, which define their rights and obligations. Governors, appointed by London, or by proprietors, as in the case of Pennsylvania, administer daily affairs. However, local power is not entirely absent. Elected colonial assemblies allow residents to vote on laws and raise taxes. This form of autonomy, encouraged from afar by the Crown, gives colonists a taste for self-government. Nevertheless, in the 17th century and up until the mid-18th century, there is no sense of unity between the different colonies. Each evolved within its own space, concerned with its economy, borders, and internal organization, with the sole higher authority being London's oversight. At the same time, England implements strict mercantilist policies to profit from its colonial empire. To strengthen its economic power, it issues the first Navigation Acts in 1651. These Navigation Acts stipulate that certain goods can only be transported on English or colonial ships, and that transatlantic trade must systematically pass through English ports. The idea is to ensure that the metropolis controls the flow of goods and benefits primarily from customs duties. Gradually, these laws become more specific and stronger, making direct trade with other European powers difficult. The colonists, aware of the importance of the British market, and especially the protection offered by the Royal Navy, mostly comply with these rules. However, this policy also limits their commercial outlets and quietly fosters some discontent. These trade restrictions notably impact the infamous triangular trade, in which the North American colonies play a key role. Sugar and molasses from the Caribbean are exchanged for European manufactured goods, while African slaves are deported to the New World to work on plantations. The ports of Boston, Newport, and Charleston grow wealthy from these exchanges, and the use of servile labor gradually expands. Although initially concentrated in the southern colonies, Virginia, Carolina, slavery also affects the northern colonies, where it remains less widespread. Thus, the mercantilist regime contributes to the development of a flourishing colonial economy, but also creates a structural dependence on the metropolis, reinforcing future tensions. Demographically, the expansion of the 13 colonies is spectacular. If at the beginning of the 17th century, the English population in North America numbered only a few thousand souls, by the 1750s, it approaches 1 million inhabitants. To immigration from England are added flows of Scottish, Irish, German, Dutch, and African populations, the latter brought forcibly via the slave trade. This mosaic of cultures and faiths accelerates linguistic and religious diversification on American soil. The Anglican Church remains influential, but it coexists with a multitude of Protestant denominations: Puritans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Quakers, and Baptists. Moreover, the colonists become familiar with a sometimes hostile natural environment, maintaining both peaceful and violent relationships with Native American nations. Gradually, despite the variety of origins, a form of American identity begins to emerge, still embryonic, but nourished by the common experience of colonial life and the distance from the metropolis. From the beginning of the 18th century, conflicts between European powers directly impact the North American continent. France, established in Canada, then called New France, since the early 17th century, controls vast territories, stretching along the St. Lawrence River, in the Great Lakes region, and down to Louisiana. The French ally with several Native American tribes, often fostering more cooperative relationships than the English, especially in fur trading and mutual defense. England and its colonies seek to encroach these territories, particularly in the Ohio Valley. This strategic area, rich in fertile land and resources, arouses the covetousness of both powers. Several skirmishes break out starting in 1754, marking the beginning of a broader war that will eventually engulf Europe and the colonies, the 7 Years' War. This major conflict, sometimes called the French and Indian War in North America, saw the British, English colonists, and allied tribes against the French and their Native American allies. The battles mainly took place on the Canadian and Ohio fronts. By 1758, the situation tilted in favor of the British, who were better supplied and supported massively by the colonists. The fall of the fortress of Louisbourg in 1758, followed by the capture of Quebec in 1759, sounded the death knell for French dominance in Canada. In September 1760, Montreal capitulated, sealing the end of New France as a military power. The conflict officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763. This treaty marked the transfer of almost all French possessions in North America to Great Britain, except for a few islands in the Caribbean. Spain, which had supported France, had to cede Florida to the English, but received in compensation French Louisiana, located west of the Mississippi. In the aftermath of the signing of the Treaty of Paris in February 1763, Great Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, but was heavily in debt. To replenish its coffers and make its American colonies contribute more, London imposed new taxes and regulations that would crystallize growing discontent. Between 1763 and 1774, this decade of tensions profoundly transformed the relations between the mother country and its 13 colonies, already used to a relative autonomy. The fiscal measures imposed by the British Parliament sparked protests, organizations of resistance, and ultimately resounding acts of defiance, such as the Boston Tea Party in 1773. During this period, the foundations of future colonial unity and the revolutionary idea were forged. In 1764, the British Parliament adopted the Sugar Act. Officially, this law aimed to regulate the trade of sugar and molasses, widely used in rum production. The Sugar Act reduced the existing customs duties, but significantly strengthened their collection by customs officers. London thus intended to fight against smuggling, which was widespread on the Atlantic coast, and increase tax revenues from the colonies. For merchants and ship owners, this measure was perceived as a direct attack on their freedom to trade, especially since it affected a product essential to the colonial economy. Although the Sugar Act already caused some discontent in port cities such as Boston, Newport, or Philadelphia, it was mainly the following year, in 1765, that the colonists' anger reached a new level with the adoption of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of March 22, 1765, introduced the obligation to purchase a tax stamp for any official document, be it newspapers, contracts, legal documents, or even playing cards. This measure was unprecedented. It directly targeted the population, not just the major maritime trade actors. Lawyers, printers, and the press bore the brunt of its impact. In a colony already proud of a certain freedom of expression and self-governance, the obligation to affix a tax stamp on each document quickly became unbearable. Protests multiplied, not only in the streets, but also in newspaper columns. Pamphlets flourished, denouncing the principle of taxation decided in London without consultation of the colonial assemblies. Thus was born the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." In other words, no taxation without representation. The idea of parliamentary representation for the colonies at the Westminster Parliament was deemed unacceptable by the Crown and the majority of British MPs. To them, the colonies were supposed to be virtually represented, meaning they were already part of the empire and, as such, their interests would be indirectly considered. But to the colonists, this notion of virtual representation was not equivalent to direct representation. They believed that, without elected officials in Parliament, the new taxes were imposed illegitimately. The debate quickly went beyond the mere legal framework. It crystallized a deeper challenge to British prerogatives on American soil. Protest movements are emerging, encouraged by fiery speeches and journalists who relay the news across the 13 colonies. The colonists organized massive boycotts of goods imported from England, fabrics, manufactured products, tea. In ports such as Boston and New York, assemblies of merchants, artisans, and citizens press for no one to procure British goods as long as the new taxes are not repealed. These economically effective boycott actions begin to worry London traders who fear for their market shares. In this climate of anger, one group will play a decisive role, the Sons of Liberty. Formed in 1765, these radical patriots orchestrate propaganda campaigns and do not hesitate to use rough methods against tax collectors or royal administration agents. The famous tar and feathering is an example. It involves publicly humiliating royal officers deemed complicit in the Stamp Act. Among the notable figures of this movement are Samuel Adams and John Hancock, both established in Boston. Samuel Adams, a great orator and shrewd strategist, manages to mobilize the crowds. John Hancock, on the other hand, is a wealthy merchant whose fortune and influence help financially support the resistance actions. In October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress meets in New York. 9 out of 13 colonies send delegates to debate how to proceed against the British Parliament. This meeting marks the first time such intercolonial coordination is set up to contest a decision from London. The participants draft the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, in which they express their loyalty to the Crown while asserting that only their elected representatives can legitimately tax them. The document demands the repeal of the Stamp Act. Facing this widespread opposition and the hostility of British business circles, Parliament eventually backs down. In March 1766, it repeals the Stamp Act. However, the repeal of the Stamp Act does not end the standoff between London and its colonies. On the contrary, Parliament follows up by adopting the Declaratory Act in 1766, which reaffirms the metropolis's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases. Then, in 1767, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, proposes new taxes on a series of imported products: glass, paint, lead, paper, and especially tea. These Townshend Acts are supposed to generate funds to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, making them less dependent on local assemblies. London seeks to consolidate its administrative control in America, which only further fuels colonial resentment. Once again, the colonists organize boycotts to put pressure on British imports. Riots break out in some places, and London responds by sending troops to maintain order. Boston, in particular, becomes a hotspot of resistance where British soldiers and American civilians coexist under tension. On March 5, 1770, a dramatic incident known as the Boston Massacre occurs in the streets of the city. An altercation between residents and soldiers goes wrong, and the latter open fire, killing 5 civilians. The event, widely reported by patriot newspapers, stirs strong emotions throughout the colonies. Even though tensions slightly diminish afterward, and London eventually lifts most of the Townshend taxes, the memory of these deaths remains etched in the minds and feeds mistrust of the Royal Army. While most of the taxes imposed by the Townshend Acts are abandoned, one exception remains: the tax on tea. In 1773, the financially troubled British East India Company received significant privileges from the British Parliament. The Tea Act, adopted in the spring of the same year, allows this company to export its tea directly to America, bypassing intermediaries. The goal for London is to enable it to sell its tea cheaper in order to clear its stocks. Paradoxically, although this measure reduces the overall price of tea for the consumer, it nevertheless maintains a symbolic tax, a principle that is strongly rejected by the colonists. For them, it is evidence that London persists in wanting to levy unjust taxes without representing the interests of the local assemblies. Beyond the financial aspect, the Tea Act is felt as a direct affront to the principles of liberty and autonomy that the colonists are beginning to cherish. The American merchants, who distribute the tea and risk losing their profit margins, ally with the patriots to protest. In the fall of 1773, several ships loaded with tea from the East India Company dock at the ports of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. In the first 2 cities, the colonists managed to send the ships back without unloading the cargo. But in Boston, the situation deteriorates. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, refuses to send the ships back and wants to enforce the unloading of the tea. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised as Native Americans, to symbolize freedom from British control, boards the ships and throws overboard 342 chests of tea, equivalent to several thousand pounds sterling of merchandise. This event, which went down in history as the Boston Tea Party, had a considerable impact. In the eyes of the Crown, it is an act of vandalism and outright rebellion. For the Patriots, it is instead a symbol of resistance and assertion of their rights. Outraged by the affront of the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament responds by adopting, in the spring of 1774, a series of repressive measures known as the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts to the colonists. Several laws directly target Boston and the colony of Massachusetts. The most striking is the closure of the port of Boston until the tea cargoes destroyed are reimbursed. This decision stifles the economy of the city, whose dynamism relies on maritime trade. Simultaneously, The so-called Government Act removes a significant portion of Massachusetts's governmental autonomy, strengthening the governor's powers and limiting unauthorized public meetings. Other provisions, such as the Quartering Act, allow for British soldiers to be housed among the populace and intensify the military presence in the region. London hopes thereby to set an example and discourage rebellion in the other colonies. However, this strategy has the opposite effect. The closure of Boston's port elicits an outpouring of solidarity among the 13 colonies. Food, clothing, and money flow into the city to help the residents survive the blockade. This solidarity strengthens the previously fragile sense of common identity. In reaction to the Intolerable Acts, more and more colonists advocate for coordinated action. In several assemblies, debates now focus on the possibility of federating to defend their rights. These coercive measures actually become the catalyst for a collective consciousness, the idea that an injustice against Boston is an injustice against all the colonies. In the face of the harshness of the Intolerable Acts, colonial leaders consider a new substantial meeting. The aim is to bring together representatives from each colony to discuss a united response to the acts of the British Parliament. On September 5, 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. Within this Congress, discussions are intense. Some participants remain loyal to the Crown and still hope for conciliation, while others, more radical, already call for active resistance. This diversity of opinions doesn't prevent them from adopting, in October 1774, a general boycott of British goods. They also draft various petitions addressed to King George III, to whom they remain officially subjects. The goal is to achieve the annulment of the Intolerable Acts and the recognition of their rights, particularly the right to not be taxed without representation in Parliament. However, few encouraging signs are coming from London, especially since, on the ground, the repression continues. The Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, receives reinforcements and increases surveillance on the colonial militias forming. In this climate, one speech resonates particularly, that of Patrick Henry, delivered on March 23, 1775, before the Virginia Convention, where he delivers his famous "Give me liberty or give me death." This speech, emblematic of the radical movement, echoes throughout all the colonies and reinforces the idea of an inevitable confrontation. As the situation worsens, it becomes evident that another Congress will be necessary. The representatives decide to meet again the following spring to reassess the strategy to adopt and consider, if necessary, the creation of a true common military organization. On May 10, 1775, as the first clashes have already erupted, we will return to this. The Second Continental Congress opens in Philadelphia. The tensions of the winter and the events in Massachusetts make the discussions even more urgent. Among the main decisions made, one of the most important concerns, the establishment of a Continental Army. Until then, each colony relied on its own militias, poorly coordinated among themselves and mainly responding to local authorities. Now, the representatives want to unify these forces under a single banner. In June 1775, Congress opts for the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. This Virginian aristocrat, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, enjoys a certain prestige. His choice allows, politically, to seal the alliance between the northern and southern colonies. Washington accepts the task with solemnity and commits to serving without pay, further enhancing his popularity. Thus, the embryo of a colonial army is born, supported by unprecedented political coordination. Although these decisions follow quickly, they are based on the growing belief that only force can compel Great Britain to consider the colony's demands. Since the adoption of the Intolerable Acts, Massachusetts has been on high alert. Boston, in particular, is under the close control of British troops, commanded by Governor Gage. But, in the surrounding countryside, groups of militiamen, nicknamed Minutemen for their ability to be ready for battle at a moment's notice, organized to defend their territory and stockpile weapons. Concord, a small locality about 30 kilometers west of Boston, houses significant caches of powder and munitions. On the night of April 18th to 19th, 1775, the British launch an expedition to seize these stocks, anticipating an imminent uprising. The operation is supposed to remain secret, but signals from Paul Revere and other messengers managed to alert the countryside. The militiamen, warned of the approaching British column, mobilize. On the morning of April 19th, skirmishes first erupt in Lexington and then in Concord. Shortly before dawn on April 19, 1775, about 70 militiamen gather on the village green of Lexington. They face a far larger British force, several hundred strong. The order to disperse is given, but in the confusion, a gunshot, still impossible to know which side fired first, rings out. This exchange of fire results in several casualties among the militiamen. Although the skirmish ends with the colonists' retreat, it symbolically marks the irreversible shift toward war. The British continue their march to Concord, where more fighting occurs. This time, the local militias, now more numerous, successfully resist, even forcing the royal troops to begin a retreat to Boston. On the return journey, the British soldiers encounter heavy fire from the woods and stone walls used as cover by the colonists. Losses are significant on both sides, but the difficult retreat of the British, harried all the way, galvanizes the militiamen. For them, the conclusion is clear. The feared English army can be challenged by determined volunteers, despite its superiority in numbers and training. The confrontation on April 19th is quickly regarded as the official start of the armed conflict. Patriot newspapers publish heroic accounts of the bravery of the Minutemen, while London depicts these events as a dangerous rebellion. Militarily, the immediate consequence is the siege of Boston. Militias converge on the city to contain the British garrison, thus inaugurating a state of blockade that will last for months. After Lexington and Concord, the militias virtually encircle Boston. The British troops, entrenched in the city, seek to maintain control of its land and maritime access. On their side, the colonists quickly understand the importance of the heights adjoining the peninsula. They allow for the bombardment of the city and the port. The hills of the region, including Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula, therefore constitute crucial strategic positions. On the night of June 16 to 1775, about 1,000 militiamen occupy Breed's Hill, considered better suited for defense than Bunker Hill, though it is higher. They hastily fortify rudimentary defense lines, digging trenches and erecting parapets. At dawn, the British troops discover these fortifications, which directly threaten the port and the city. General Thomas Gage, assisted by General William Howe, decides to launch a frontal assault to dislodge the rebels from these too close positions. On June 17th, under a blazing sun, several thousand British soldiers cross the bay in barges to assault Breed's Hill. Although novices in conventional warfare, the militiamen are entrenched behind their makeshift barricades. They benefit from an advantageous position and have received the famous order to fire only at short range, a command that legend summarizes as, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The first two British charges are repelled with heavy losses. The colonial redoubts inflict a real carnage on the English ranks, who persist in advancing at a quick pace. During the third attack, the militiamen, short of ammunition, must retreat and eventually abandon the hill. The British take the position, but their victory has a bitter taste. They deplore more than 1,000 dead and wounded, a high figure for the time. In the colony, this episode has a considerable impact. If a regular army, reputedly the most powerful in the world, has suffered so much against poorly equipped volunteers, It proves that these volunteers can indeed stand up to the empire. The British losses also shocked public opinion in England, where people suddenly realized the intensity of the fighting. For the insurgents, Bunker Hill, despite their final retreat, is an encouraging sign. The coming months will see George Washington take command of the Continental Army and impose some discipline in the ranks. The multiplication of these clashes, although limited in scope, convinces more and more colonists that there is no way back to simple obedience. London, for its part, sends new reinforcements and hardens its repression, which only fuels the patriotic momentum. On January 10, 1776, Thomas Paine, an Englishman recently arrived in America, publishes a short work in Philadelphia entitled Common Sense. Sold in tens of thousands of copies in a few months, this pamphlet achieves immediate and resounding success. Paine defends an audacious thesis: the pure and simple independence of the colonies from Great Britain. His clear and striking tone contrasts with the legal or diplomatic formulations previously favored by colonial leaders. In Common Sense, Paine attacks hereditary monarchy, which he describes as an archaic and unjust system, and praises the virtues of a republican regime based on freedom and equal rights. He denounces King George III, accusing him of ignoring the legitimate grievances of the colonists, and presents the struggle against London not as a simple fiscal revolt, but as a moral fight against tyranny. His style, both direct and passionate, touches a wide audience, including modest readers or those unfamiliar with political texts. Until then, most of the settlers had hoped for a compromise with the crown, essentially requesting the cancellation of taxes in respect for their rights. Common Sense provoked a shift. The idea that the conflict could no longer be resolved through negotiations gained traction. Influential leaders who hesitated to support complete separation were now convinced that independence was the only possible path. In taverns, public squares, and newspaper columns, Paine's proposals were hotly debated. The pamphlet sparked a wave of fervor in the colonies, where increasingly public opinion rallied behind the idea that remaining under British monarchy would only lead to more conflicts. The public also became familiar with new concepts, like the natural right to freedom, which Paine linked to a worldview inspired, among others, by Enlightenment philosophers. Within a matter of weeks, the public conversation increasingly leaned towards the prospect of a definitive break. As Thomas Paine's work circulated actively, skirmishes continued sporadically on the ground. George Washington, appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in June 1775, endeavored to impose effective discipline and structure on his troops. Although supported by the Continental Congress, the Army suffered from numerous problems. Soldiers lacked weapons, warm clothing, and food, and pay was often delayed. In the winter of 1775-1776, the staff faced desertions by some volunteers who were exhausted or demoralized. Nevertheless, the popular enthusiasm born from early successes, notably the resistance at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, did not entirely wane. Many citizens, both men and women, committed themselves to supporting the war effort. Women organized collections of food and clothing, made uniforms, and cared for the wounded in makeshift hospitals. In every colony, committees of public safety worked to ensure a minimum level of supplies. Washington took advantage of these local resources, aware that without public support, his army could not hold out long against Britain's professional troops. Aware that the colonies could not fight alone against the British power indefinitely, Congress leaders sought allies abroad. As early as 1775, envoys were sent to France to explore the possibility of military and financial support. The memory of the 7 Years' War which had violently pitted France against England, led some American patriots to hope that King Louis XVI might be receptive to weakening his British rival by supporting the colonial revolt. Spain, another European power wary of the United Kingdom, was also approached. However, colonial diplomacy was in its infancy. No European state wanted to risk openly committing as long as the colonies had not formally declared their independence. In May and June 1776, the question of independence now occupied the center of debates at the Second Continental Congress. Several colonies had already authorized their representatives to vote in favor of a total break, while others remained more reserved. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, proposed a resolution stating that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The discussion was initiated, and a committee was formed to prepare an official draft. Thomas Jefferson, a young lawyer and planter from Virginia, was chosen to be the principal author, assisted by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. In late June 1776, Jefferson drafted a declaration project that echoed the principles advanced by the Enlightenment and, more recently, by Thomas Paine: the right of peoples to break away from a tyrannical government, the importance of individual liberties, and the necessity of founding an equitable society. After some minor modifications, Congress voted on this text. On July 2nd, the Resolution of Independence was officially adopted, and on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was formally approved and proclaimed. The Declaration of Independence consists of several parts. In the preamble, the text lays out fundamental philosophical principles, such as the equality of all men and the existence of inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, influenced by the ideas of John Locke and other liberal thinkers, argues that the government is only legitimate if it derives its power from the consent of the governed. Next, a long list of grievances is addressed to King George III, accused of violating these principles by multiplying abuses, imposing taxes without representation, suppressing the legislative rights of the colonies, maintaining an oppressive military presence, etc. This catalog of complaints serves to justify, in the eyes of the insurgents, the necessity of definitively breaking the political ties with the British Crown. Upon the announcement of the vote, an immense relief mixed with enthusiasm fills the Patriot circles. In major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, public readings of the Declaration are organized, bells are rung, and artillery salvos are fired in celebration. The militiamen, for their part, feel empowered with an even more legitimate cause, which they now consider as a fight for freedom, not merely a tax rebellion. However, this fervor is not unanimous. Some citizens remain loyal to Great Britain, either out of conviction or economic interest. These loyalists, sometimes called Tories, are skeptical about the viability of an independent nation. They fear a long, deadly war, and doubt the colony's ability to organize sustainably without the support of the Crown. In some regions, families are divided over the question of independence, creating tensions that will traverse American society throughout the conflict. On the London side, the reaction is immediate and firm. The Declaration of Independence is considered an act of formal rebellion, even high treason. The government of King George III, already worried about the rise of insurrection, now sees the necessity to deploy all available military means to quell this secession. The months that follow prove to be crucial. England hopes for a quick victory to deter any other revolt within its empire, while the insurgents rely on their soldiers' determination and foreign aid to stand up to the greatest power of the moment. During the summer of 1776, Great Britain mobilizes substantial resources to regain control of the situation in North America. The brother of General William Howe, Admiral Richard Howe, leads an impressive fleet that lands in New York Bay. This naval force, combined with troops stationed on Staten Island, demonstrates London's determination to crush the fledgling rebellion. The objective is clear: control New York to separate New England, the epicenter of the rebel movement, from the rest of the colonies. Facing this threat, George Washington understands the symbolic and strategic importance of Manhattan. He sets up his army to defend the city, but he is outnumbered and, above all, at a naval disadvantage. The British, possessing a powerful navy, can easily move their troops and encircle the American positions. In August 1776, the Battle of Long Island constitutes the first major confrontation of this campaign. The Americans, poorly prepared and inexperienced, find themselves facing significantly superior British and Hessian mercenary forces. Rapidly, their lines collapse under the enemy's pressure. The defeat at Long Island on August 27, 1776, forces Washington to organize a daring nighttime evacuation. His troops discreetly retreat to Manhattan, taking advantage of the fog and confusion to escape encirclement. This episode, though heroic in its execution, does not suffice to reverse the course of events. Confronted with the growing pressure of the British forces, the Americans ultimately have to abandon Manhattan in the fall. Washington chose to continue the retreat northward, then westward, crossing New Jersey toward Pennsylvania. The successive setbacks sapped the morale of the Continental Army, all the more so as desertions were multiplying. Living conditions were difficult: lack of pay, worn equipment, barely formed regiments. The British, on the other hand, seized New York and established solid bases in this region, which they would hold for a good part of the war. After this campaign, the insurrection seemed to falter, and the Continental Congress, entrenched in Philadelphia, feared a total collapse. As the end of the year approached, the situation for the insurgents seemed desperate. Washington's troops were exhausted, and some soldiers whose terms of enlistment were about to expire were thinking about returning home. The general understood that he needed to act quickly and, surprisingly, to reverse the dynamic. On the night of December 25th to 26th, 1776, he ordered the famous crossing of the Delaware River in the middle of winter. Under snow and ice, his men crossed the water in makeshift boats. The operation, particularly risky, remained unknown to the Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. At dawn on December 26th, Washington and his soldiers surprised the enemy outposts. The Hessians, who did not expect an attack in the middle of Christmas night, were quickly overwhelmed. This swift victory resulted in the capture of nearly 1,000 mercenaries and the recovery of valuable supplies. Psychologically, the impact was considerable. The news spread quickly, and the colonial population regained some hope. The Continental Congress hailed it as a coup de théâtre that restored the Continental Army's will to continue the fight. Bolstered by this success, Washington soon struck again. He decided to leave part of his men near Trenton to make it appear as if he were staying there and headed toward Princeton, where other British and Hessian troops were stationed. On January 3, 1777, the Continental Army engaged these forces in a relatively brief battle. Once again, the element of surprise and Washington's tactical prowess led to victory. The battles of Trenton and Princeton, even though they were not massive in terms of troops engaged, had a considerable moral impact. In the space of a few days, the Americans proved that they could still create the unexpected and challenge British superiority. Many volunteers rejoined the Continental Army, whereas they had been tempted by desertion or indifference. Politically, these successes convinced Congress to continue supporting Washington and to strengthen the war effort. The year 1777 thus began under better auspices for the rebel cause than it had ended. Despite the American victories of the winter, the British Army remained largely superior in number and equipment. London planned a large-scale campaign for 1777. The main idea was to cut off New England, considered the cradle of the insurrection, especially Massachusetts, from the southern colonies. To do this, General John Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, devised a bold plan to start from Canada, come down the Hudson River Valley, and take control of Albany in New York State. In theory, forces coming from the west and southeast were supposed to converge to encircle the rebels and deprive Congress of its most solid logistical base. However, British coordination fell short. General William Howe, who commanded the troops based in New York, hesitated to leave the city to move up the Hudson. Fascinated by the idea of capturing Philadelphia, the political capital of the insurgents, he devoted a good part of his resources to this undertaking. Meanwhile, Burgoyne ventured into the forests of northern New York State, unaware that the promised help would not come as planned. Supply difficulties, rugged terrain, and the fierce resistance of local militias began to slow his progress. While Burgoyne is painfully advancing north, William Howe implements his own plan towards Philadelphia. In September 1777, he lands his troops in the Chesapeake Bay, thus bypassing the American defenses. Washington, aware of the symbolic stake of the capital, tries to oppose, and the two armies confront each other on September 11th at the Battle of Brandywine near Wilmington, Delaware. The British eventually prevail, forcing the rebels to retreat. A few weeks later, on September 26, 1777, Howe occupies Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to flee hastily to York, Pennsylvania. Determined to regain the initiative, Washington attempts a counteroffensive at the Battle of Germantown on October 4, 1777, but fails to dislodge the British. This new defeat, despite American combativeness, reinforces the impression of London's strategic superiority. The loss of Philadelphia is a severe blow. The city was the political and intellectual heart of the Revolution, the very symbol of the Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, the situation deteriorates for General Burgoyne. Isolated and lacking reinforcements, he encounters resistance from the American militias in the wooded areas near Saratoga on the Hudson. Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, despite some personal rivalries, managed to effectively coordinate their troops to block the British's path. The decisive battles unfold in two phases between September and October 1777. The Americans demonstrate surprising tenacity and superior knowledge of the terrain. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne is forced to surrender at Saratoga. This major defeat astounds British public opinion and boosts the morale of the Americans. Beyond its military significance, the Battle of Saratoga represents a defining moment for the future of the conflict. France, observing the evolution of the battles closely, now perceives the validity of the American insurrection. These rebellious colonies are capable of defeating a regular British army in a major confrontation. King Louis XVI and his advisors, notably Foreign Minister Vergennes, see this as an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to their historical rival. Thus, the possibility of a Franco-American alliance becomes concrete. American representatives in Paris, including Benjamin Franklin, have been advocating for this for months, but the victory at Saratoga finally assures France that it is not committing to a lost cause. In February 1778, a Franco-American alliance treaty will be officially signed, forever altering the nature of the conflict. But by the end of 1777, the young Continental Army is already savoring an unexpected victory. while Washington, despite the loss of Philadelphia, knows he can rely on the resurgence of a movement even more determined to achieve its independence. When France decides in February 1778 to sign an alliance treaty with the United States, it is not only the result of political calculations, it is also the result of the particularly skillful diplomacy of Benjamin Franklin. Arriving in Paris in December 1776, he quickly finds his place in the salons of the aristocracy and circles of power. Thanks to his enlightened spirit, his quick wit, and his image as a wise American philosopher, Franklin charms the French high society. He surrounds himself with other Continental Congress representatives, such as Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, who help him negotiate a concrete rapprochement with Versailles. Aside from Franklin's personal charms, France still harbors a strong resentment towards Great Britain since the defeat of the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which costed its territories in North America. For the French monarchy, supporting the American insurgents is therefore a means to take revenge and rebalance the power dynamics with its hereditary enemy. The negotiations result in two major texts, signed on February 6, 1778, a treaty of friendship and commerce, which officially recognizes American independence, and a military alliance treaty, committing France to fight alongside the colonists. The consequences of this alliance are immediate and considerable. On the financial front, France agrees to advance significant sums to help the Continental Congress pay and equip its troops. Weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and supplies begin to flow to the American continent. Moreover, the arrival of high-ranking French officers provides invaluable tactical support to George Washington. The Marquis de Lafayette, already engaged since 1777, quickly becomes a symbol of this Franco-American fraternity, while the Count of Rochambeau, sent later, commands an expeditionary force intended to support the Continental Army on the field. The French naval reinforcement also changes the game. Until now, the Royal Navy dominated the seas, allowing London to easily move its regiments and supply its garrisons. With the French fleet entering the fray, new opportunities open up for the American patriots. Even though the French Navy is still in the process of modernization, it has assets capable of threatening British logistics, particularly by cutting or hindering naval communications between the metropolis and its colonies. In a sense, this alliance symbolizes the moment when the American-British conflict turns into an international war. France's participation in the conflict sends a strong signal on a European continental scale. Other powers, initially hostile to Great Britain, question the opportunity to join the Franco-American camp. Thus, in 1779, Spain, led by Charles III, goes to war against London. It sees a golden opportunity to reclaim Gibraltar, a strategic stronghold firmly held by the British since the early 18th century, and to recover Florida lost during the 7 Years' War. Spain, which has never ceased to compete with England for control of maritime routes, thus becomes a natural ally of France and the Americans, even if it does not fully endorse the idea of a colonial revolution. Furthermore, in 1780, the United Provinces, ancestors of the present-day Netherlands, also find themselves drawn into the war. Tied to England by trade treaties, they were initially neutral, but British pressure, combined with some Dutch pro-American interests, eventually pushed them to engage. One of the main stakes for the United Provinces is the defense of their maritime trade and colonies, particularly in the Caribbean. Henceforth, naval rivalry between Great Britain and this Franco-Hispanic Dutch bloc unfolds in the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Caribbean Sea, creating a military chessboard of unprecedented scale. Until 1778, London could focus most of its efforts on the American Rebellion, but the situation changes radically with the expansion of the conflict. Now, the British Army and Navy must be divided between several theaters of operation: the protection of trade routes with the East Indies, the defense of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the securing of Caribbean possessions, vital for the sugar economy, not to mention, of course, the war on North American soil. The French, the Spanish, and, to a lesser extent, the Dutch harassed the Royal Navy in an attempt to disrupt transatlantic traffic. In the Caribbean, French squadrons attacked British islands and organized occasional blockades. Spain, for its part, launches a siege of Gibraltar in June 1779, mobilizing a considerable force in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. From Great Britain's perspective, this multiplication of fronts is costly, not only in men, but also in material and financial resources. The conflict, which was supposed to be a quick and decisive colonial war, turns into a global competition, reminiscent in many ways of the global dimension of the 7 Years' War. Among the notable naval confrontations of this period, the Battle of Ushant, which occurred on July 27, 1778, demonstrates both the tenacity of the belligerents and the limitations of strategic coordination. Off the coast of Brittany, a French fleet commanded by the Count of Orvilliers confronts the British squadron of Admiral Keppel. The battle, poorly engaged for both sides, ends with an indecisive result, but reveals the vigor of the Franco-British rivalry. The losses are relatively limited, yet each side claims victory, highlighting the symbolic importance of these battles for public opinion in Europe. In the Atlantic, American ships, often small, backed by the French Navy, venture as privateers to harass British merchant convoys. Officers like John Paul Jones make a name for themselves by leading daring raids on British coasts or in Caribbean waters. Though the material impact of these attacks remains modest, it contributes to further straining diplomatic relations and forces Britain to disperse its naval units even more. Each ship detached to hunt down the privateers weakens the British ability to project power against the Continental Army. On North American soil, the arrival of qualified French officers bolsters the organizational capacity of the Continental Army. The Marquis de Lafayette, already present since 1777, uses his charisma and relations at court to foster a solid alliance between Washington and the French High Command. This cooperation becomes more formalized when, in July 1780, the Comte de Rochambeau lands in Newport with an expeditionary force of about 5,500 French soldiers. Empowered by this new aid, Washington, along with Rochambeau and Lafayette, embarks on more ambitious campaign plans. His aim is to surprise the British with combined maneuvers, marrying the French firepower with the local terrain knowledge of the American troops. Logistically, the French provide crucial support: heavy artillery, engineers, uniforms, and even funds that allow for the payment of militiamen's salaries and maintain popular support. This military synergy, still timid in 1780, gradually strengthens and will climax during the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. As early as 1779, British strategists, aware of the difficulties encountered in the North, particularly after the defeat at Saratoga in 1777 and the constant harassment from local militias, decide to focus their efforts on the southern colonies. They see several advantages. The southern regions are vital for the agricultural economy, notably the cultivation of rice and tobacco, and London counts on the support of the numerous loyalists supposed to reside there. The initial successes are not long in coming. The capture of Savannah, Georgia in December 1778, followed by that of Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780, seems to confirm the validity of this strategy. Charleston is then one of the most important cities in the South, both commercially and politically. Its capture represents a severe blow to the American war effort. Over 5,000 militiamen surrendered during the capitulation. Strengthened by this victory, the British placed the region under military command, hoping to quickly control South Carolina, then move up towards North Carolina and Virginia. In their minds, this campaign should consolidate a grand southern front rallied to the crown, while pressure on the northern colonies would continue from New York. However, this British projection does not account for the emergence of American military leaders who are both determined and ingenious. In response to this British push, new American officers distinguished themselves. Nathaniel Greene, appointed by George Washington at the end of 1780 to command the troops in the South, brings an innovative strategic vision. Aware of the opponent's numerical and logistical superiority, he opts for guerrilla tactics and harassment, exploiting the terrain knowledge and mobility of his men. While avoiding risky pitched battles, Greene also knows how to seize decisive engagement opportunities when they arise. Daniel Morgan, another talented officer, achieves one of the most notable victories of this campaign, the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. By cleverly using light infantry and positioning his troops to deceive the enemy, Morgan confronts Colonel Banastre Tarleton, whose cavalry and Hessian infantry suffer a bitter defeat. A few weeks later, Nathaniel Greene faces the British at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina on March 15, 1781. Although the Americans ultimately retreat, the losses inflicted on the British troops are substantial enough to weaken their grip on the region. These successive defeats force English commanders to reconsider their plans and retreat to safer areas, notably in Virginia, where General Lord Cornwallis hopes for a naval evacuation by the Royal Navy. Following the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, General Charles Cornwallis, tasked with leading the British campaign in the South, deemed it preferable to withdraw his forces to the coast to facilitate their resupply and, if necessary, their evacuation. He set his sights on Yorktown, Virginia, located at the mouth of the York River, not far from the Chesapeake Bay. From there, Cornwallis hoped to establish a fortified base from which the Royal Navy could evacuate him or send reinforcements. His choice was dictated by the difficulties he encountered in maintaining control of the interior against American harassment tactics. However, he was unaware at the time that a formidable Franco-American maneuver was underway. George Washington, stationed in the north near New York, had long hoped to attack the British garrison in that city, but he learned that the French Admiral de Grasse was heading towards the Chesapeake Bay instead. The plan was then modified. A quick march by the Continental Army and Rochambeau's French troops would trap Cornwallis in Virginia, while the French fleet would block maritime access. This complex coordination was put into motion during the summer of 1781, without the British, focused on defending New York, fully realizing it. The success of this operation relied on the excellent rapport between Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette, who was already operating in Virginia. While Lafayette maintained pressure on Cornwallis's outposts, Washington and Rochambeau undertook a long journey from the north, deceiving the British about their true destination. Arriving near Yorktown in September 1781, the Franco-Americans converged to encircle Cornwallis's positions. Meanwhile, the Comte de Grasse deployed a powerful fleet in the Chesapeake Bay, blocking any access by the Royal Navy. On September 5, 1781, he defeated the British squadron of Admiral Graves at the Battle of the Virginia Capes, also known as the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay, definitively preventing Cornwallis from receiving any maritime aid. This naval victory, pivotal in the history of the war, ensured the success of the siege unfolding around Yorktown. Faced with a complete blockade and pressured by the combined artillery of the French and Americans, Cornwallis attempted several sorties to break the encirclement, but without success. Starting from late September, the Franco-Americans tightened their hold by digging trenches and installing artillery batteries increasingly close to the British fortifications. Intensive bombardments, the impossibility of escape, and the certainty that no reinforcements would arrive from the Royal Navy eventually convinced Cornwallis to surrender. On October 19, 1781, the British garrison, consisting of about 8,000 men, surrendered. This capitulation marked a decisive turning point. Great Britain lost one of its most significant expeditionary forces on American soil, and public opinion, both in London and in the colonies, clearly perceived the advantage gained by the insurgents. Although sporadic fighting continued in some regions, Yorktown is generally considered the event that hastened the end of the conflict. In the aftermath of Yorktown, the British government of Lord North was shaken. Already weakened by the extension of the war to other fronts and by pressure from the opposition in Parliament, it gradually lost the necessary support to continue the fight. In February 1782, Lord North eventually resigned. A new cabinet, more favorable to a negotiated outcome, formed in London. Peace talks then opened, first informally and then more officially, in Paris. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay represented American interests. Although France, an ally since 1778, played a major role, its interests did not always align with those of the insurgents. The Court of Versailles hoped for a peace that would permanently weaken Great Britain, while Spain, also at war with London, aimed to recover lost possessions. The American negotiators, while remaining grateful for French support, maneuvered cautiously to obtain the broadest possible British recognition of their sovereignty and advantageous commercial rights. After long months of discussion, peace is concluded by the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783. Several essential provisions are included. First, Great Britain officially recognizes the independence of the United States, whose borders are set east of the Mississippi, north to the Canadian border, and south to Florida, now returned to Spain. The Americans also obtained significant fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which constitutes a major economic asset for the young United States. On the side of the European powers, France emerges from this conflict with a certain prestige, having actively contributed to the defeat of its British rival. Nevertheless, its war effort has drained the royal finances, which will have long-term consequences on the kingdom's internal stability. Spain regains Florida and consolidates its hold on part of the territories of the Gulf of Mexico. Although the English are defeated on American soil, they retain control of Canada and maintain their naval supremacy on many trade routes outside the North Atlantic. But this war has laid the groundwork for future rivalry in new theaters, notably in the Indian Ocean. In the months following the signing of the treaty, the gradual departure of British soldiers stationed in America is organized. The last contingents leave New York on November 25, 1783, a symbolic date when the city, held by the English since 1776, finally returns to American control. A large number of loyalists, colonists who remained loyal to the crown during the war, then choose to move to Canada, where they establish English-speaking communities, or to directly exile in Great Britain. For them, American independence often means the confiscation of their property and social rejection. The United States then faces the immense task of becoming a sovereign nation. Although unity was forged in the fight against the British Empire, internal divergences quickly emerge at the end of the conflict. The 13 states must reconcile their particularisms while building common institutions. The years following the war thus see the drafting of the first constitutional texts, with the implementation of the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and later the adoption of the Federal Constitution in 1787. The Republican ideals, born from Enlightenment philosophers on the European continent and crystallized in the Declaration of Independence, soon crossed the Atlantic. By 1789, France is ablaze in turn. King Louis XVI who had financially supported the American cause to weaken his British rival, paradoxically finds himself swept up by the revolutionary wave that these same ideas helped to fuel. The principles of liberty and equality, spread through pamphlets and speeches, resonate in all corners of Europe and the world, nurturing other uprisings and dreams. This shift, initiated at the end of the 18th century, outlines a new future, where the aspiration for the sovereignty of peoples will continue to redefine, far beyond the 13 colonies, the history of humanity.